Thank you very much indeed for, I think, persevering with us because I think there's been quite a lot that's been discussed, a lot absorbed. Nobody press a button. I think we're linked actually, you and I. So if you switch yours off, I'm dead. Our lives are linked. There we go. All right, so a lot's been discussed, a lot's been charted. We've had different conversations about education, health, corruption, employment, transforming society. And I think there's even a session right now about the environment that's taking place. And what this proves more than anything is that we have the ability to think things through, diagnose problems, and even come up with solutions. And we've been doing this since 1994. However, and I'm glad we've got the chair of the National Planning Secretariat next to us because the National Planning Commission, they had a diagnostic report in June 2011. And in there, they set out South Africa's achievements and shortcomings since 1994. But one thing that they did identify was a failure to implement policies as one of the key problems for South Africa moving forward. So, this session, I think, more than a lot of the others, becomes quite critical because we can come up with the solutions, come up with the ideas, but they mean nothing if they're not put into practice. And so, this is a conversation that we're going to try and have now. We all, I think, agree that the NDP is a great plan, great blueprint. It sets up a way forward. But I guess at the end of the day, until the job is done, again, it's another document that was a good idea, but without its implementation, it's not going to make the difference that we need it to make for our people when we talk about poverty, inequality, job creation, all these wonderful things that we want to do for our society. So, literature generally suggests there are different ways of implementing policy, top down, bottom up approach, principal agent, you name it. And I'm just wondering, what approach have we been using in South Africa since 94? What has been the failures of or the challenges of those approaches? And does there need to be a difference in approach? Because I don't think that policy itself has been the problem, but how we make that policy practice. So, if we define implementation as the process of turning policy into practice, I think the conversation we need to have now is how do we get the job done? How do we implement policy? How do we move forward so that the NDP doesn't become another historical document that children have to study in the future and say, once upon a time we had an NDP, that too was rewritten 10 years later and we had something else. Okay, so if you look in your books, we've got the biographies of our panelists, and they're all experts in their areas of work, and I think they'll contribute a lot to this conversation. But at the end of the day, I really am looking forward to hearing your contributions, and hopefully we can come away from here today with some solid ways to get the job done. Because that's really, for me, the most important thing. I think policies are there, we've discussed them, we know what they are. But how do we get it done now? How do we translate what we're doing into practice? So, without further ado, I'm just going to ask our panelists just to give us their opening thoughts about this very difficult task of policy implementation. And I'm going to start with Khulekani Mathe, who's the head of the National Planning Commission Secretariat. So you came up with this NDP, and you've asked us all to get involved, and people talk about it as the sort of savior, and I get a sense also that this perhaps might be the last roll of the dice before things get completely out of hand. So, how do we make it work?
Thank you very much, Peter. Just to say quickly that, policies must be understood for what they are. They are statements of intent which often set out an ideal that we want to achieve as a country, as people, and so on. But reality is obviously different from the idea that is often set out in policies. So, how do you move from that ideal? I'm going to suggest that policy implementation requires obviously the people, and we will talk a bit more about that. It requires institutions, it requires instruments, it requires leadership, and obviously as an element of the people as well as civil society. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, starting with instruments, some of those instruments that start to turn the ideal into something that can be realistically implemented are concrete plans. But plans themselves can play different roles. You have plans that are sort of visionary, they inspire, they are meant to allow us to see and embrace the impossible. You've got plans that are meant to set a strategic framework, a strategic direction, and you've got plans that are meant to deal with the detail of implementation, kind of operational plans. So if you ask me for a quick diagnosis, I would say that perhaps if you look back over the last few years, in some instances, we ended at just having a policy and not take it down to the instruments that will make that policy realizable. And when we planned, perhaps we've just left it at the high level strategic framework that sets a direction, but it still does not give you the nuts and bolts of how to get things to happen. So we've got to work through and make sure we've got these instruments that tell us what needs to be done to the finer detail. Quickly, institutions, you also need institutions that enable the implementation of policy, and those institutions could be laws, they could be all manner of other institutions that should facilitate implementation. But institutions should themselves be flexible and allow for innovation. Try things out, learn from your experiences, and improve on that. We tend to have institutions but create so much rigidity so that we're locked into a path that does not deliver the results. And thirdly, I talked about the people. People are central to implementing policy, and this is people and their skills and attitudes. Unfortunately, both of these things are not taught at any school. Schools will teach you and prepare you for learning and acquiring skills, but schools themselves or universities are not going to give you skills. We think that just because we have sent people to schools and training institutions, we have created the skills for the country. And by this, I'm suggesting that there's a role for all manner of institutions in society, businesses and so on, to then, after people have been through an education and training process, to actually acquire skills. Again, we tend to go halfway and say, we've sent you to school, we think that you have the skills. And finally, I would talk about leadership. Leadership is absolutely critical to inspiring people to work hard, instilling a sense of hard work, but also a sense of being a winning nation. And so that we do not settle for less, we do not settle for a draw, we do not settle as we always do and say and hope that other people are going to lose their games in order for us to qualify. We need leaders who are going to, in all sectors of society, who are going to inspire us to be on top, to want to be on top in everything that we do, whether it's education, whether it's business, whether it's all manner of sports that we get involved in. So my argument here is that we need instruments, we need institutions, we need people, and we need leadership to implement policy. And I can go into some detail on each of these during the discussion.
All right, Khulekani, thank you very much indeed. Okay, so you spoke about people quite a bit, and one of the things that keeps coming up in us through the NDP and discussions that we've been having is that we've got to do this together. So, Ebrahim, Fakir, you're next, and a question for you, I guess, part of it is, the ruling parties of the day go out, tell the people, these are our policies, this is what we're going to do. The people say, this is great, we love that, we're going to vote for you. They vote, and surely it should be easy then to get the people to cooperate with that party or that government to get the job done. Somehow it's not happening. Why?
Thanks, Peter. Why? I don't know. I suppose you have to ask the people why. Why it's not happening. But, I mean, I can perhaps hazard a few guesses, but I'll come to that as I go along. I mean, there's important questions that you've touched on, but there's a couple things I need to say as a preface. And the first is that we do, as I've been listening over the past day and a half from last night, about this mythology of what happened before our transition in 1990. And there appears to be a fundamental misrecognition of the fact that the context has changed fundamentally. What civil society may have done before 1990 was vastly different from what it needed to do between 1990 and 94, and therefore what it had to do after 1994, because the context has changed. You're no longer under a system of unjust rule. You're now under a system of just rule, of democracy, of inclusion. So that's the first recognition. The second is a misrecognition which has to be undone. And the misrecognition which needs to be undone is that there's a difference between the public and the private. And civil society, which is all of us here, actually fall within the private realm. We're not the public. And so to ask the question, what does civil society do to implement policy, is in my view a fundamentally misguided question. Because if you want civil society to implement policy, then why on earth would you elect a government? So why are you going to have, I mean, government is there to govern, and government is there to implement policy. Now, I know I've said something which is fundamentally, perhaps rude is the word, but I'll explain why I think this is, why I think what I think. The third point to make is that we are in a very difficult moment, and there's lots of orthodoxies which are out there. One of those orthodoxies is this myth that the post-apartheid state is by definition developmental and transformative. This myth is now increasingly in question because it is neither developmental always, nor is it always transformative. And I'll justify why I say so. Quite apart from the difficult moment of a mischaracterization of what the post-apartheid state is there's also a mischaracterization of the society. There's this idea that we're a plural, inclusive, democratic, equal society, and we're not. We have the highest inequality factor in the world. Let me draw your attention also, just if you think about fundamental political rights, to two things which happened in the last 2 years. We went to an election in 2014, and I don't think we've given sufficient consideration to the amount of subtle intimidation that the governing party has unleashed, not just on social movements, but also on the opposition parties. Number one. Number two, if you remember, the DA tried to march on 2 occasions on what they called a youth subsidy, once to the ANC and once to COSATU. And in both instances, and I hold no truck for the DA in spite of the fact that I might be wearing a blue blazer. But the truth is, these people were met on the streets with bricks. Now, it is intolerant in a society which pretends to be tolerant to have these kind of things going on. And this is not just true for opposition parties. Speak to people in social movements and people who are involved in some of the 700 or so protests which happen every year, and you find a very different narrative of how state policy in the security cluster is being implemented. So, just with those prefatory remarks, and Peter, I'm not going to go on for too much longer, but I wanted to put some of those issues down to rest. Now to come to the question of actually implementing policy. Any state needs 5 fundamental capacities, and I would argue that more or less in South Africa some of these are in fact missing. The first is high regulatory capacity. And what we find, if you look in detail at policy, so Peter, unfortunately, this challenges one of your orthodoxies that policy is okay, it's just the implementation is the problem. Yeah. Is that actually there are fundamental contradictions in the way in which some of the policies are configured. Let me give you one example. You have BEE as a policy, okay? And you give a BEE contract to a transport company which must deliver something as fundamental as medicine. But the BEE company doesn't have the infrastructure, the route network, the logistics support, the warehousing, and everything else which is required to, in fact, deliver this thing on scale and efficiently. So you meet one policy target. Yeah, you may have deracialized a bit of the economy and you've given some black person equity. But you've undermined a fundamental development challenge and issue because you haven't delivered medicine on time. The same is true for things like textbooks. So the first in this thing about implementing capacity, implementing policies about regulatory reform and regulatory alignment and symmetry. Because at the moment there's fundamental asymmetrical relationships in the way in which policy is configured. Take another example, economic policy. We had $12 billion worth of inflows in South Africa into the last year. But because of the incentives for financialization of the economy, of that 12 billion, the rate of job creation was not in proportion to what the inflows were. Why? Because financialization means that hot money can leave the country very quickly. Secondly, if you have growth, output growth in a particular sector of the economy, for example, mining, 3% growth in the mining sector, but jobs growth is not 3%. Jobs growth is 0.2%. Now, of course, you can't expect that there will be symmetrical growth. If growth in output is 3%, then you will have 3% growth in jobs. That's unrealistic. But you should have at least a factor of half. So if growth is 3%, then jobs growth should be 1.5% at the very least. That's not happening. There's a fundamental misalignment between certain growth sectors in the economy and the way in which jobs are created. So I've pointed to two contradictions, both in the question of fundamental political rights, but also in the way in which our policy is configured. The second area is administration. So quite apart from regulatory capacity, you need the ability to administer the state and administer policy. I challenge you to go to many local governments and ask for basic records about how many people are unemployed in the area, how many homes are indigent, how many people on social grants, how many schools in the area, how many kids need to go to no-fee paying schools. And I dare you to be able to bring me at least 60% of the data which is required. So if a simple thing like administration of keeping records is unavailable, your ability to actually implement policy is low. The third is the area of technical capacity. And here I don't need to go on about skills shortages and other things, but if you have an unemployment rate of close to 40%, then you've got to ask yourself serious questions about what technical capacity might exist in your society. The fourth is the area of extractive capacity, the ability of the state to actually extract resources in order to fund development. And with the problems in SARS and everywhere else, I did not tell you what the problems in extraction are going to be, in spite of the fact that SARS actually overshot by 7 billion what its take was going to be in the last tax year. However, that doesn't mean that there's sufficient trust in the way in which these institutions function in the public, number one. Number two, there isn't sufficient trust broadly in society that many of the extracted resources from society are in fact being sagaciously implemented in the areas where they're required. The last is the question of enforcement and coercion. And a state without enforcement capacity is no state at all. And if a state is unable to engage in enforcement, that is, discipline people who've committed an infraction and punish them appropriately, then trust in the entire edifice of the policy making and policy implementation regime breaks down. And consistently, what we have seen is not a consistency in implementation, but an inconsistency. It is fundamentally inconsistent depending on whose political objectives are being met on the day. So if these areas are missing, then your ability to actually implement policy is low. Lastly, it is impossible to actually implement policy in an environment of low trust. We've got low trust levels among citizens. So if you ask people on the basis of race how much they trust other people, it's quite low. If you ask people how much they trust people within their own community, it's much higher. Now that matters if you want social cohesion. But social cohesion is a fundamentally undemocratic concept because what it tries to do is that it tries to conceal the differences that might exist in society under this catch-all phrase. it also poses a fundamental problem for building a non-racial project. If you only trust people who are like you, but you don't trust other people, then your ability to construct non-racialism is limited. If we come to the question of trust in institutions, they are low. If you don't believe me, you can look at public opinion surveys, and the most highly rated institution with regard to public trust is the Electoral Commission. The police is low, the courts are low, and guess which is the lowest? Political parties. And if you're asking me what's the connection between policy, people, and political parties, it's the question of trust. And if you don't have trust both in institutions, but not even amongst yourself as citizens, your ability to actually implement policy is low. And we simply need to look at an example from the north of our border. If you can't get the consent of people to implement policy, you can only implement it through coercion. And when you coerce people into a set of behaviors, they literally leave the country a mess.
All right, Ebrahim, great opening statements. Thank you very much indeed, and a great diagnosis. And I'm hoping as the conversation unfolds, you're going to tell us what the magic formula is to fix it. Actually, to reverse these challenges that we have.
I get paid to study, not to solve them.
Okay, thanks. Coovadia is the Managing Director of the Banking Association of South Africa. So you're wearing two hats, civil society, but you also understand how the private sector works. And I'm just wondering if you can bring both of those hats to the party. How do we get the job done, Kes?
Yeah. Given what Ebrahim has said, maybe we should just all go on a holiday. Let me just start with a couple of points. I think one point has been made that the National Development Plan is a plan. It's a high-level strategic plan. Does not give you too much detail on how you should do things, and that's what I think it should be. What we're looking at in business and certainly in the banking sector at the moment is how do we extract from the National Development Plan programs that are pertinent to the banking sector. And we're looking at three areas: small, medium enterprises, infrastructure finance, and human settlement development. And how do we, on the basis of what the National Development Plan says about those and what we need to achieve in the next 20-odd years, how do we develop and what sort of concrete programs do we develop to actually implement to meet the vision of the National Development Plan? Okay. So those are the discussions we're having. I think that there are a couple of things that need to pertain to make these things happen. The one, and I still don't think we've got it, is there needs to be a clear and unequivocal commitment from government to the NDP as the central plan for this country, to which other plans must actually adhere to and dovetail with. I don't think we have that. I agree with Ebrahim to a great extent on the policy issue, but besides whether we have good policy or not, the other problem is that we don't have policy consistency. So on virtually every critical policy in the country today that you need consistency and certainty on, for particularly, let's say, business and to implement. You open the paper today and you open the paper tomorrow, you think you actually get the impression you're talking about totally different policies on the same issue. So there's no consistency, and as a result of that, there's no certainty, and that to a certain extent inhibits the ability to implement. I also think that business itself needs quite a lot of introspection. I think that business generally is not very long-term in its approach. I think business needs introspection to understand what we need to do, what sort of interventions we need to make, guided by the National Development Plan, because we support the National Development Plan. And there's a whole lot of things we can do as business without government doing anything. And we need to ask, what do we need to do now so that we're still doing business in 20 years' time? If you look at the environment that Ebrahim has painted, and I don't disagree with it too much, if we don't make the necessary interventions now that actually create the basis for us to build an inclusive economy we're simply not doing business in 20 years' time. So it's not a nice to have for business, it's critical for its business. So I think that business needs some introspection, needs some proactive, long-term leadership to implement the plan. Civil society, and again, I agree with Ebrahim. I think that one of the problems with broader civil society today, labor movements, other NGOs, and so on, is that we carry on like we're still, mobilizing against apartheid in the 80s, which is something I used to do. I used to throw bricks in the 80s because we had a government that was illegitimate and we wanted to bring that government down. We now have a government that we're voting for. It's a very different role for civil society. You've got to hold the government to account in different ways. You've got to build governance. You've got to involve people in governance. And so I think that civil society, certainly some critical organs of civil society also need a lot of introspection on how they're going to implement. I think we also, it's not that we don't talk in this country. And I agree again with Ebrahim. There's lack of trust. But it's not because we don't talk. We just don't talk about the right things. We don't talk about the hard issues. Every time we talk, in mass meetings of 60, 70, 80 people, so we establish a war room on the ESCOM thing and we'll end up with 120 people there. What do you do in an emergency situation with 120 people in the room? You do absolutely nothing. So we don't get the right people together, we don't get them together in small groups so that we can actually make ourselves feel uncomfortable and start talking out of our agenda, then out of our comfort zone. And until we do that, and we also need to realize that each of us, each sector, business, let me speak for business since I work for a business organization. In having these discussions internally, we have to appreciate that we're going to have to make trade-offs. If we look at national interest, we're going to have to make trade-offs as is government, as is labor, as are others. None of us should be talking to just our own agenda. And so it's those sorts of discussions we need to have. And then all of this needs to be managed in a way that is not just economic growth, but it's got to be inclusive economic growth. We can't persist with the severe levels of inequity and inequality in the country. Not because we're good people, but because in the long term it just is not sustainable for anybody. So we've got to do that. Then just one final point, Peter, is that there's also debate about, I think some people in the previous panel said that it's communities themselves who understand what they want. And I've got no argument with that. But an understanding of that under an illegitimate government and an understanding of that under a democratically elected government, in my view, is different. I think that, yes, government must consult. But they must consult because they elected people. They must give some thought to what sort of development needs to happen, and they must consult on that development. And at a point in time, they must take decisions. They must govern. Now, I chair an organization for the city where we develop a lot of the city's infrastructure. And we communicate and we consult with community groups and so on. We're about to start building, and some group comes up. You haven't consulted us, so we're going to stop the building. Well, then you put them in jail. Okay? You put them in jail. Because you can't have a situation where you carry on like that. And so I think that we need to look at it.
Okay, so again, some suggestions of what we need to fix, a lot of highlighting of things that if they carry on as they are, we're not going to progress. But again, as this conversation unfolds, I want to know, ABC, this is what we'll do from tomorrow for us to be able to implement these things. And I don't know, does it mean we just take the opposite of what you're saying? So if you're saying we haven't got this, we must just get those things, I wonder. But we'll get some clarity on that. Okay, civil society again. Haroon, Rasheed, Aboo, Kalla is the chairperson of Awqaf Foundation of South Africa. How does civil society, we've found out now that civil society has to change the way that it thinks, functions, given that we're in a different dispensation now. What do we do? How do we help, or how do we encourage? How do we manifest this MVP so that it actually does something?
Assalamu alaikum. In the name of God, the Beneficent and Merciful. Thank you for having us here. And Peter, let me see if I can attempt to answer the question you asked, a very critical question. Of course, I echo everybody's sentiments and what was already said. Ultimately, I think this initiative is about a civil society initiative, about how we can partner to change the condition of South Africa. At the end of the day, what was said yesterday evening was either we're going to float together or we're going to sink together. And I think nobody here or in South Africa wants to sink. We want to float together. So just to put a context to some of the issues that I'd like to build on as far as what we can do, is there are 10 areas that have been identified in terms of the National Development Plan. It's housing, water, electricity, sanitation, safe and reliable public transport, quality education and skills development, safety and security, quality healthcare, social protection, employment, recreation and leisure, clean environment, adequate nutrition. And of course, we as civil society can't tackle all these problems. So we need to extract from there a few key areas that we need to deal with and perhaps partner with the government. So clearly, the government has not been able to do it on its own. If we take the example of education, let's take one aspect of this. I don't know if anybody has managed to look at the history of South Korea, but in the 60s, they had education sub-40s levels, 40%, below 40%. Within 20 years, the literacy rate was sub 40% in South Korea. Within 20 years, literacy rate in South Korea was in the high 90s. So, I mean, we've had a new political dispensation, and we haven't been able to get, in fact, I think in the ratings last week, we were sitting in terms of education number 85 in the rankings. Now that's a serious indictment on us as a country, as a government. And what are the issues? I mean, if you take South Korea today, it's a very brilliant case history that we should look at. I think one of the things is that we are not looking at what has been done internationally and how we can learn from that, because they say people who learn from their own experience. I was listening to our brother here, said that we've got to learn from our own experience. They say people who learn from their own experience are clever. But they say people who learn from others' experience are super clever. And I believe that the time has come for us to reassess and look at some of the countries that have made it happen. One of those countries that I admire tremendously is South Korea. You take what they've done. Just one aspect of education they focused on for 20 years. They got it right. And that led to a serious transformation. And it impacts many of these things that we talk about. If you have a good education, you don't have to look for nutrition. And you don't have to look for the government to provide you handouts every month for nutrition. Because you can find a job. And if you can find a job and you have good skills in the country, then that's going to address, Ebrahim, the investment we're talking about. So, I mean, people don't want to invest money in South Africa simply because they we don't have adequate skills. So it's a kind of a catch-22 situation. What are we going to do about this? So as civil society, and also I just want to mention the conditions for successful implementation that came out in the NDP. So 7 conditions. One was breaking the plan into manageable chunks, develop detailed plans, building on board support for the plan, building trust and confidence among key role players, which is us, I hope, strengthening public sector capacity, streamlining reporting procedures, and consistent messaging, as Brother Kes was saying. I mean, the messaging is always different. The policies are changing every day. So that's being set out as a condition for successful implementation. It's no wonder that we as a community, I think there is no consistent messaging from government. If we have the consistent messaging, and I think that if we can, out of these 12, if we can say 8 of them, and we take 6 or 5 or 3 or 4 critical ones, and we say this is critical for our government to do in the next 5 years. Because sometimes, if you're addressing issues, you take 11 issues together. Firstly, we don't have the money to address 11 issues. It's impossible. I mean, and it's a kind of, if we looked at point number 5, strengthening public sector capacity. It's a catch-22 situation. We are spending 200 billion plus on social grants. Nobody has a problem with social grants. We have a lot of poor people. We have a post-apartheid issue. But then just if we saved all the wastage that we have from public sector spending and we're able to channel that into a decent education program, I mean, in 10 years, we'll just see a huge difference. I mean, how can we be living in a society in 2014, 2015, 2,500 children who've been accepted at university are not able to afford to continue their education? That's totally unacceptable. And yet we spend 250 billion, sort of giving people fish. And this is the fishing rod. So we need to change our mindset. Ideas should be poverty elimination, not poverty alleviation. And then coming to a few key points, obviously I will add later to this conversation. But we cannot we've got to, if we take the recent issue that we have in xenophobia, I mean, really, I was telling somebody, I say, xenophobia is not a result of people being envious only. It's a result because KZN, for example, has something like 50% unemployment. 50%. Is it normal in any society? It's highly abnormal. Can you have 35% unemployment in the country for 12 years and the government does not really intend doing anything serious about it? And sorry, they may intend it, but it's definitely not happening. We're not seeing it. Now, in America, in the US, if unemployment is 10%, there's pandemonium. They go berserk. They say, what's happening? The economy is collapsing. I mean, when else have we had government looking at unemployment and saying, you know what, we have that. I mean, we should have a barometer on unemployment. So these issues, if we identify 3 or 4, and the key issues that I'd like to suggest that we should, as civil society, maybe tackle are entrepreneurship, education, and employment. We can do something about it. Business can get itself involved in unemployment. Business can get itself involved in education by providing bursaries, because it's easy. We can't provide sanitation because that's in the hands of, infrastructure development and so on. And of course, there's thousands of entrepreneurs, and we can share that entrepreneurs. So in that's just my idea.
Okay. Thank you very, very much indeed. And again, I'm hearing interesting statements being made, extracting key areas of the NDP. My only worry there is and I think Ebrahim highlighted a bit earlier when he said, if all of the things are not done at the same time, actually, those little things that you think you're fixing won't be able to happen. And I saw it happen with AIDS in the early days, particularly. There were lots of people doing lots of things on their own, uncoordinated, and there was duplication, and it just was a mess. And my fear is that we might do the same thing here. But I'm also getting a sense that we're talking about talks here. We're talking about what ought to be done, what's wrong. But what I need to hear, and I'm hoping that as this conversation unfolds, is when I wake up tomorrow morning, what 1, 2, 3 things am I going to do to make sure that this thing happens? Because right now we're busy chatting about, oh, we should do this. We should pay more attention to that. Yes, we know, but what are we going to do tomorrow? Because I think people need direction. And so, Godwin, I'm going to ask you to chat, and you perhaps have a difficult task now. And you might have to throw away your speech. Because people need direction. They don't know what they're going to do tomorrow morning to make this NDP thing happen. And maybe there should be bullet points. When you wake up tomorrow, go to such a place and do X, Y, Z, and then it'll happen. Because right now, we're talking about talks. Your thoughts?
Well, thanks, Peter, and good afternoon to everybody. Peter's comments have kind of disqualified half of my points. But I just want to, start by adding to the frameworks that people have taken, perspectives that they've taken. The issue of policy implementation, I think, needs to be discussed at two levels. One is the abstract, theoretical, and philosophical level. What makes policy and what makes policy work. But secondly, as you say, we've got to discuss it at a practical level. So let me be like everybody else and start at the abstract and theoretical level. I think the whole notion of a policy as something that government will implement on its own, it's a myth. It's a complete myth. So Khulekani said earlier on that policies are about intent. So policies are about what we want to do as society. And the question we need to ask is whether those statements of intent are being translated into actions and behavior. If not, we got to think very hard about how we can get the desired actions and behaviors. So I think most of the cases we go as far as expecting the state to drive the achievement of the actions and behaviors that we need to see in society. And I think it's a myth. I think the state isn't going to do that. The state can always run a process of identifying those intents, publicizing them, and so on. It also goes as far as the identity of South Africans. Who are we? How do we define ourselves? What kind of actions and behaviors do we want to see in every street, in every house, in between the street and in between the houses? If we're going to leave that to the state, it's not going to happen. So I think I've got some 5 points to suggest on how that can happen before I give a practical example of what we do tomorrow. One is that I think at that level, philosophically, we've got to drive an understanding that people must learn to do things for themselves. And I think that notion of people doing things for themselves has kind of died out. I give an example about, many people who would often sit under the tree, have beer, whilst other men are making bricks and building an RDP house, which they would thereafter walk in. So how can you've got energy. You're not disadvantaged in terms of energy to pick up a brick and build your own house. It happens in many sectors, whether it's in education. If you don't spend time and help your child to read and to read the little that's available, it's not going to happen. We're going to look at the state and it's not going to happen in the next 1,000 years. The second bit I want to share with I think policy will be implemented effectively in a conducive environment. And what will make up that conducive environment? One is that we've got to have effective public participation. If we don't have effective public participation, we will have wrong intents. If we don't have the correct, the effective public participation, the intents that are spelled out in policies will not represent what we as a nation want. Secondly, I think we need to have constructive public engagement. So it's either we are not involved or we want to put tricks and demand flat rate. I mean, it's not taking us anywhere. So engagement has to be constructive. There's certain extent and certain ways in which we have to express our wishes, which have to be, I think engendered in the policies, in the intents that we have. But all that, I think, have to be balanced with, effective, public participation. public accountability. So we want to push for public accountability of the government and the people who have put forward to run our government. Enough with this conceptual and abstract stuff. So what do we do tomorrow?
Yes, please.
I'm going to use an example of the organization I work for. I work for an organization called the National Education Collaboration Trust, born about 2 years ago in July 2013. The organization was born out of an agreement between business, government, labor, and civil society to collaborate on education improvement. And we've identified practical programs that we're going to implement together. We're raising resources together in order to implement this program. So it's a national initiative. It involves everybody. We've identified some people who would oversee, the affairs of the organization. But it has practical actions. It has practical commitments. It has practical pieces of flesh that each of the stakeholders have to bring, to the party. And there's nothing that stops us from having such in every little community. So, again, on a very subjective case, I'm not setting up a foundation, I'm setting up a bank account and a set of rules that will determine 100 rands that's contributed by each of the people who have gone to my primary school. Simple. It is simple. And people say, no, we're not going to get involved in it. It's 100 rands. How long do we take to spend 100 rands? A few minutes. But if you had 100 of your people who have gone through a high school or primary school, putting in 100 rands a day, a month, you've got 10,000 rands a month. Then you as a community can do something about it. I think it goes to the core of who we are as South Africans. I don't think that we should go and adopt how other countries have gone about. There's good lessons that we have to learn. But this country's democracy has been delivered through that kind of collaboration. Why all of a sudden do we want to throw away our DNA? Why all of a sudden do we want to turn our attention to the state to provide? The state did not provide for many of us before 1994. All of a sudden we've lost so much potential and capacity in this country by people wanting to wait for the state to provide public services. So very last, the National Education Collaboration Trust is designed around 6 themes. The first one is the professionalization of teaching. None of us here would have gone without a month without complaining about teachers, the ethos of teachers, or the quality of teaching, and so on. So that's one of our focus areas. We're working with unions, we're working with teachers themselves, we're working with the council of teachers and whoever is involved in promoting a professionalism amongst teachers. So I must say it's not like a hot knife, through butter. It takes a lot of pushing and but these hard things that Cass has spoken about have to be spoken with the relevant stakeholders, and we have to move away from just pointing a finger, because everybody can point a finger, but very few can actually take some actions. So the second theme is promoting courageous leadership, and we're still fiddling with how we promote courageous leadership from the very low levels of the schooling system to the highest level. Do you know that many people who are in positions of power, most of the times, know what's the right thing to do, but they are scared to do the right thing because they get vilified, either by political parties or by labor, and they don't get protected by the civil society. We fold our arms and say, these guys aren't able to make decisions. But when they make decisions, they get pushed, they get fired. We know where to be seen. I have tons and tons of cases where people in management have made the right decision, got pushed, got fired, and nobody said nothing about it. The third is improving the technical capacity of the state, to deliver, education, and that's very direct to policy implementation. The fourth is improving, increasing resourcing of the various, institutions in our society, whether it's schools or that healthcare, project and so on, organizing ourselves to increase resourcing, to promote self-help activities in society. Community involvement, I've spoken about that. We've set up what we call district steering committees in the 8 district education districts that we work in. We've gotten people who are respected in society. We've gotten representatives of unions, whether it's traditional leaders, religious leaders, youth, into one structure. And we've said the education of your kids in this district is your responsibility. So if there's a looming strike, call your unions and talk to them before this thing bursts into a big, a problem. So I think that's one way of rekindling public community involvement in service delivery. So, I mean, those are some of the practical ways that we've taken up the challenge that the NDP has posed, for us, and that can be done at every level of the society, whether it's in the mosque, or whether it's in a church, or around the school you went to, or the community that you are in, or that community social healthcare project. I think we can take up the responsibility and change the kind of and work towards the kind of actions and behaviors that we want to see of South Africans.
Godwin, thank you very much indeed. Let's give him a round of applause. Okay, so time's really not on our side, so I'm going to start the conversation with you and perhaps pose some questions. But before that, I just want you to say thank you very much to Coovadia. He has to leave, unfortunately, pressing business engagement. So we thank him for giving us some contribution to this conversation, and thank you for all your time. So thank you very much. Oh. All right. Okay, so here's the thing. We're going to start these Q&As, these questions, and hopefully get some answers. But I just want us to think practically, because I think we talk ourselves to death sometimes. And we know what the problems are. We know what the issues are. And, I keep thinking of my home country, Zimbabwe, where the average Zimbabwean is not waiting for anyone to help him. I promise you. He's not expecting government to bring any Christmas bag or anything like that. He basically says, okay, I'm in trouble. I've got to make a plan, otherwise I'm going to starve. And I just want us to think perhaps of, we know that there are problems with government. We know that there's problems with cadre deployment. We know that there are problems with corruption. We know that there are problems with all of these things. What do we do with the cards in our hands to get the job done? I think this is where we need to be really focusing our conversation now. So I'm going to take 3 at a time, and please, if you could just be very quick with the questions, and I'm going to get our panelists to be very quick with responses as well. But let's think practically now, because we know what the issues are. We know what the problems are, but I need to hear more of what we're going to do tomorrow. What are we going to do practically with the cards in our hands? It's no use imagining and hoping for something that's not there right now. What can we do with what we've got right now? Okay, so I saw, sir, with you had your hand up first, and then you, and then you. Those are the first 3, and then I'm mindful of you.
Yeah, my name is Shabir Musa. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Fritz, family physician. I just wanted to make 1 or 2 comments, and it was basically to say that in government responses, and I've heard this through the day, there must be care in not talking about active citizenry and using that as a proxy for government to abrogate its responsibilities. And I think we need to guard government on that. That doesn't mean we are not going to be active citizens. And I think that if we have to take the way forward, we should be asking the question, what can it do differently in terms of engaging government? And the question being raised about people not expecting things to happen. If anything, the post-apartheid government set about doing is to create jobs and hand them out. And I think that's really been the tone that's set for the society. People are expecting that because you've set that tone about it. And I think if anything one needs to do is to move back, start making people, start asking the question, how is the public service skills-based as opposed to just jobs for friends? I think that if we have to ask ourselves, what do we do tomorrow? My suggestion is that this conference is together people. And what we should be asking is, how do we take the process forward? I'll just finish. So sorry about that. I think if we have to look at it, is to say, how do we take that process forward, and particularly in terms of ASRI as an organization, and I don't think we should expect ASRI to be everything.
How do we take that process forward?
My suggestion is that ASRI, in fact, can facilitate a process, at least to start having follow-up meetings to such. But I think we all need to take responsibility. It's not ASRI to do that. But I think every one of us can go back and talk about the NDP, and perhaps ASRI can facilitate us coming back together and explore these issues. And I think that itself is a begin point. But I think that we have lots that is happening amongst the constituents here that need to be shared between us. That in itself means that collaboration in society might be able to not only enhance those actions amongst the people here,